Thanks for tuning in to this episode of I Have Something to Say, where subject matter experts are unafraid and unapologetic about sharing their perspectives regarding issues that impact our lives. They speak up because basically they give a shit. So if you're tired of canned answers and want to finally hear real people cut through the BS and talk about real issues, this is the podcast for you. I'm your host, Sami Heyman Marrero from Urbender, and behind our mixer is our producer, María J from UdoU.
Hello, everyone. I wanted to invite a friend, a community activist, a leader, a fellow comadre, and Latina, María Torres López. ¿Cómo estás, María? How are you?
Ooh, very good. Very good. Thank you for the invite.
Yes, absolutely. I wanted to reach out to you, and let me tell you a little bit about María. María is the founder of Diáspora and Resistencia. That means diaspora and resistance, and with a focus on building a new Puerto Rico. She works with oh my God, a number of organizations that are led by Latinos and Puerto Ricans to really work on issues that affect the Puerto Rican community and really the Latino community in general, and BIPOC communities too. Because I know she believes it's one and the same, right? Our grievances and our challenges. Big on environment, immigration, housing problems, tenant relationships, prison reform issues. She works very closely with local, national, and when I say local, Florida, local, national, and international social justice groups such as the National Latina Institute of Reproductive Health, Palm Beach County Coalition of Immigrant Rights, Florida Immigration Coalition, the Miami Workers Center, Global Empowerment, Vamos for Puerto Rico, Paz para la Mujer, Frente Ciudadano por Auditoría de la Deuda, Vamos for Puerto Rico. Again, Women's March Global. You were one of the organizers and part of the advisory council, right? For the Women's March. Florida Rights Restoration, Black Lives Matter Alliance, and I can just go on and on and on. And I just mention all of this because you'll get to understand why I invited Maria to be our special guest for this episode of I Have Something to Say. Maria, how did you become so involved and why with the work you do with the community and becoming an activist? What propelled you to dive in head first and be part of change?
So it started in Puerto Rico. I was born and raised there. And in Puerto Rico, there is a culture of activism that is ingrained in our culture, right? There's so many things that we have had to fight for so many decades that is just ingrained on who we are. And when I was in Puerto Rico, I was very active politically. And after I moved, I had to go through a process of understanding what it meant to live here, what it meant to be diaspora, what it meant to be Puerto Rican on the Americans' eyes, which is very different from what it is considered to be Puerto Rican in Puerto Rico. And so that took me a few years. And then there was a disconnect, of course, that the diaspora goes through at the beginning, where you do have to disconnect yourself a little bit from your country in order to be able to kind of assimilate, even though there is never a full-on assimilation. And then after 14 years outside of Puerto Rico and seeing how much more people were working to change what they didn't want to go through anymore, but that they were not listened to, I started to work with groups in the diaspora that were Puerto Rican groups. And I realized that many of the subject matters and many of the messaging that comes out of Puerto Rico ends up being, I don't know if in the process of translation or it's just of different agendas, but the point is that it gets changed. And when it gets to Congress and when it gets to the politicians that it needs to get here, the messaging has changed. And what ends up happening is that the laws and the policies that end up being passed are not exactly what the people in Puerto Rico intended it to be. And that's what propelled me again to say, oh, this is not that simple. If I want to really affect a change in the same way I was doing it in Puerto Rico when I lived there, I have to be way more involved than I've been, because there's definitely there's a big disconnect between the messaging that is coming out of Puerto Rico and the messaging that gets to Congress.
Right. Yes. And I know that that's how we met, right? Because we get called upon, hey, la mesa, hey, this, hey, all of these. We've been to retreats together, and I feel like although we've had a chance to speak, we really haven't had a chance to talk and to have a real
Exactly.
deep conversation. But you're the first person that came to mind when I just recently sat in a panel and I made a comment. And the question posed was, what role do Latinas have to impact the US? And what does that look like, and how can they do it? How can they start becoming part of change, or making an impact? And my comment was, well, we're doing it already. We're doing it already just by the sheer numbers. When you think about that, almost 20% of the US population is Hispanic. That means 2 out of every 10 people, and one of those 2 people is female, so meaning a Latina, right? That means that 1 out of every 10 people in this country is a Latina. I mean, the numbers don't lie. Think about it. I mean, that's like mind boggling. It's crazy, right? And so then I said, so just by the sheer numbers, we're already impacting our community. Through our cultural values, through our participation, through just being there, embedded in the communities across the nation. And this is not a New York thing anymore. This is not a Miami thing anymore. No, no, no. We're like pretty spread out. Okay. And so that being, remember, 1 of every 10. So that being said, my answer was that I feel that we just need to be more intentional as Latinas in terms of lifting each other up and creating opportunities and getting into places of influence where we can use our spheres of influence to infiltrate. And I did like this, like that, and I said it's like the CIA. We need to infiltrate every aspect of society, every industry, in the corporate sector, nonprofit, government. Like, we need to infiltrate, and it's our own little CIA. But it's not CIA like we know it. It's the Comadres in Action. And what was that for? And everybody was like, "Oh my God, Comadres in Action, CIA." And comadre, for everyone out there, is like when you have kids, you choose a godparent and godmother, and that's your comadre. But it's more than that, really. When you have an extended family, it's like a sisterhood, within our culture. And it really happens a lot in other cultures too. I don't think it's a thing that's unique to Latinas, but we really, really have that comadre bond, right? That
We hold on
solidarity.
to it. We hold
Yeah,
on
we
to it
really
for
do hold
sure.
on to it, and really, how do you say, act on it, right? So I
Yes.
mentioned Comadres in Action. After the panel, I got like 4 calls. You better register that shit. And I'm like, oh my God, okay. So I wanted
Did
to
you
talk
already?
about it. I did. I got the .com, .org. I have the fictitious name DBA. I locked that shit down. Anyway, but that's another topic. We'll
Awesome.
talk off the line, right? But I said, who can really talk about this? And you were the first person that came to mind. I'm like, I need to call Maria Torres-López. We're going to talk about those steps that are needed, as part of this movement of Comadres in Action, where we lift each other up and we can really make a difference by honing into those positions, right? And harnessing those decision making positions and infiltrating every sector to get things on the right track, like Latinas mom know how to do, right? And so I know that we spoke about like these key components, which is participation. Like when you got here, you're like, okay, I need to start getting involved and participating. The other one is organization, mobilization, And all that leads to representation, which is where we want to be, right? And so, talk to me, what does like real participation in your view look like? And can women, whether you're, working outside of the home or you're domestic engineer, and work in the home, right? Like how can you participate? How can you plug in?
So when it comes to women participation, it's not only about creating the space for another women to sit along with you on the same table, but it's also making a safe space, right? We have to stop saying that, oh, you have to show up, you have to show up. But I have to show up for what? To be tokenized? Because that not only happens within the American community when they bring us to the table, that happens within our own communities. And we have to be able to speak about it and mention it right there when it's happening and say, we're not going to invite this person, or oh, you asked me to invite this person here and now you're not listening. We have to stop the conversation right there and then. We have to make the safe space for them if we want them to come back. Otherwise, they will not come back. And that's one of the main problems that we're seeing when it comes to organizing and then mobilizing, right? You have all these meetings to organize, you have all these phone calls and conferences and panels that we're part of, and we are organizing to something bigger. But if those spacers and that first contact was not safe, those people are never going to come back. So to that, I will say, yes, organize, have the phone calls, have the panels, have the conversations. But if they are not safe, you cannot wait until the meeting is over to apologize to that person. You cannot wait until the meeting is over to call whoever was doing the wrong action and correct them. You have to do it in the moment. And you have to do it respectfully, because it's not a matter of who knows best. It's a matter of that we're building something to create real change so our children and our grandchildren don't have to do it, right? So that they can elevate themselves to something else that we're so far back that we cannot even imagine. But what we need to do is build that. And the only way we build that is by having safe spaces.
So it's to create, so we need to create safe environments and safe spaces, whether it's in our HOA, whether it's in the school system, whether it's in the local, strip mall, or it's in the local church, in the churches, in the different communities we have. And I like that what you said, because that I agree with you. Even within our own communities, like the Latino community, for example, there's a lot of patriarchy going on, and so then sometimes you show up and I'm like, so what am I doing here? I'm like a wallflower, or I'm trying to, speak up, and you get the rolling of the aisles. I've had that done to me by a compañera.
I can imagine.
Yes, yeah, with my mouth, you know how that goes. But anyway, but yeah, and I'm sure
Not
you've
with your
experienced that
mouth,
too.
no. With their lack of understanding of what you're saying.
Exactly. Yes. Well, and also maybe not being used to it, right? It's also creating a safe space for them to say, "Yo, wow, I've never been," and that's okay too, to say, "I've never been. I'm
That's
sorry
okay
that I
too.
reacted this way, but I've never been spoken to by a female, in such an authority, whatever, however they're defining, my mouth." And that's okay too, but you're right, it's like creating these safe spaces where we can have these conversations, move on, that it feels real and authentic, so that way you want to come back. And that's where the
Exactly.
participation is key. So the participation is basically not a one-time thing. When you say
No.
participate, is really being involved
Oh,
in.
and people work, right? Most of the things, this is something else that we have to get out of the table, that we don't work. Our people have 2 and 3 jobs to
Right.
have a regular working class or middle class home with what that entails. And so people don't have time for meetings that are not going to be, that are not going to bring out fruit, that are not going to have something that is going to affect change. So on
Right.
every meeting, it shouldn't be just about talking. There should be actions that people can take right there and then. And
Right.
there should be actions that don't take them 3 weeks to put together. Things of that nature, because our people are busy trying to live their lives, especially if they're diaspora. Even if you're Puerto Rican or if you are from any other country and you're diaspora from that country, you are working your ass off because you left your country for something better.
Right. Right. And and that leads to organization, right? There has to be some kind of structure. There has to be some kind of next steps, some kind of an agenda and program that people feel that they leave with it with some kind of direction when we're and it's a collective thing. It's not like, oh, you do this, you do that. No, that participation needs to lead to a sense of empowerment, of ownership of that experience, of that safe space, and that they can come back with some outcomes. And that next time you come and
Exactly.
participate, that organization, that role, that how do you say, ownership of roles leads to something. Leads to something. And
Exactly.
yeah, so
But that
this
won't
is
happen if they're not being heard to and if they're being tokenized. They're not going to want to take the next step. It doesn't matter what the agenda said or what the action request is. If
yeah.
they feel that is going to be in their detriment or their waste of time, they're just not going to do it.
Right, totally. I think that happens a lot and with like ERGs and groups in different corporations, that they have them there because it's like the thing that you kind of have to do. But if it's just like a one-time thing, like, oh, Cinco de Mayo, oh, Black Heritage Month, oh, Hispanic Heritage Month, and there's no continuum of
Mm-hmm.
attention and of listening and activation, then you're right. People get discouraged and then they unplug. And
They
that's what
unplug.
you don't want to do. Yeah, because then you're not doing anything. It's just fluff, right? And so talk to me about mobilization, because you're the queen of mobilization.
Mobilization looks very different these days with COVID.
Yeah.
Mobilization can be, if you're doing something local, then it just needs to be your community, and your community doesn't need to be your next door neighbor. If your next door neighbor doesn't agree with your views, then they don't need to be part of your panel. They don't need to be part of your team. They don't need to be part of that community building that you're trying to create. Community means the organizations that are working with you with the same values. And that's very, very important, because sometimes people feel that, well, if the people in my street are not with me, then I don't have community. Well, no, that's not what community in activism looks like. Community in activism looks like organizations and the people within those organizations, right? It's not just a name of an organization. It's the people who are actually doing the work for that organization. What are their values? What do they believe in? What are they willing to do for you and for your community? To make it more tangible, for example, here in Florida, we have a lot of groups that are Latino based, that are not Puerto Rican based. However, when you explain to them what's happening in Puerto Rico, because they have the same values about decolonization, about freedoms, about LGBTQ rights, about women's rights, they can empathize with you and they will help you do the work that you need to do for Puerto Rico. So that's what community looks like in the activism world. And then they will help you to mobilize. I think as Puerto Ricans, we have a lot of heavy lifting to still do with our own people about educating them on these issues. Most of the time, Americans see us as liberals, and in the most correct sense, Puerto Ricans, for the most part, are conservatives because
Yeah.
they're very religious people. As a group, I'm atheist, so that doesn't apply to me, but I know my people and I
Yeah.
know that we are conservatives and we are Christians. And so we have to speak to our people from that lens and explain to them what women's rights are, what LGBTQ rights are, and how that doesn't infringe in their religious rights.
Right. Right. And so and it's about learning all of these different perspectives too, because the thing is, I just feel that from a cultural standpoint, And this is something that also happened earlier in the past week and a half, is that we were talking about how the Latino community and communities of color really are not monolithic, like Caucasian communities too. They're not, no community is monolithic because no two people are the same. Let's just say that, right? And
Exactly.
so when you start thinking about all of these layers and how to communicate and how to engage with others to get them to feel like they can participate, that what you're organizing has value to them, regardless of, if their stronghold is religion, if their stronghold is a political view, if their stronghold is family, if whatever it is, that we can have these discussions and put ourselves from a cultural standpoint, separate ourselves just a little bit to be able to understand where other people are
Absolutely.
coming from, and so I think that one of the key things is, and that most people that are Latino or BIPOC will come to easy terms with, is the lack of representation, which is basically the end goal of all of this work
Exactly.
that you do, right? And that we're trying to do, also with participation, organization, mobilization, is that's the end goal, is to have true representation. And so have you found that, because I see that you work with so many organizations, migrant workers, Black Lives Matters, the Women's March, and when you think about the leadership in all of these groups, those faces are they present very differently, right? And so then, do you feel that that's the glue, is that recognition of lack of representation, that people are finally turning the page and realizing that that is the common goal for everybody, that you just want to feel like you're there, like you belong, and that you're
Yes.
represented.
So when it comes to these organizations and the organizations that we organize with, the good thing is that we don't have to teach them these things, right? We go back to what are the values of that organization and that the people of the people who run them. And they understand this because they live this. They,
Mhm.
like you mentioned, they know what it is to not be represented. So they make sure their organizations have the right representation. The good thing about this, when you turn it into politics, is that they know who are the people that need to represent us at the local level and at the federal level, because again we go back to representation. So for the most part, the people that they put their money behind and the people they put their efforts behind and the phone banks and the text banks behind are those people who represent us. And in many instances they are Puerto Ricans, but for the most part they are Latino people who grew up with this understanding of what it means to not be represented. So what it means to basically not have the things you need because nobody's listening to you.
Right. Exactly. The difference is, though, if you're a recent arrival, and that's why it takes a minute to click, because when you first arrive here in the US mainland, you're just juggling 20 balls: housing,
You are.
transportation, getting a good job, a good paying job, healthcare, making sure the kids are stable and that they're okay. If you have elderly parents, what the hell am I going to do? Who's going to watch over them? I mean, you're just juggling to, adjust and navigate. And then the
Mm-hmm.
language, if you don't know the language, then you have to learn how to communicate. It's just a lot, right? And so
Yes.
when you come from your country of origin, or from Puerto Rico, for example, you're represented, because everybody in the Senate and everybody in the legislature and all of these people, all the leadership's Puerto Rican. So I mean, so you're not faced with that. And so, but when you come here is when, hopefully, right, you're able to, move, like social mobility, you're able to establish yourself and then realize, oh my goodness, this, I do, I have a say. I think that's where apathy comes in, with the civic
Probably.
engagement.
And that's
Yeah.
something that's when I go back to the work that we have to do with our own people, because it is a struggle. And people who come here, the first thing, I give you an example. When a few years ago after Hurricane Maria, and we had the big influx of Puerto Ricans to Miami, Fort Lauderdale, and Palm Beach, and Central Florida. We had, a few people reached out to me from the Democratic Party, and they wanted, the first question that came out of their mouth is, how do we get them to vote? And I said, absolutely not. We're not talking about that right now. They just passed a tremendous traumatic event, and now they're going through another trauma of coming here and all the things we go through that you just mentioned. And I'm not going to go to my community and say, well, you need to vote Democrat. That's not how this is going to go. And of course, they didn't like that. But I had to be that firewall between them and the political party, right? There is a difference between being political and being partisan. I think everybody needs to be political, and whether you like it or not, you are political. Especially if you're in this country and you're not white passing and you have an accent, you are political. Your very existence is political. And not only that, but then all the other stuff, right? We pay taxes, we pay the insurance, and we pay all of those things are political. If your schools have the things that needs to provide for your children, that's political. What we don't need you to be partisan. We need you to participate in politics, and we need you to have representation in the way of your voice and your vote, and that you contact your representatives and your senators, and that you make these groups, these communities that we were talking before, and you engage them and organize them for whatever it is that your community needs. Because at the end of the day, they work for us, we don't work for them. And sometimes that's really difficult to understand because we're not taught that, right? We're not taught none of this. And so those are the type of things that us here in the diaspora have to be mindful of. And that we're not here to implement people's agendas. We are here to implement our agenda. And for Puerto Rico specifically in this time, that means auditing of the debt, cancellation of the debt. That means removal of Puerto Rico from the Jones Act, which we can talk a little bit further if you want, especially if you live in Florida, because Florida makes billions of dollars out of that law. And it does it by enslaving financially enslaving people in Puerto Rico because they have to import 19% of what they consume.
Right. Yes, absolutely. And and just to share a little bit about the Jones Act, could you explain, what is the Jones Act and how it affects and actually strangles the Puerto Rican's opportunity to really thrive economically?
Absolutely. So there's two Jones Act. I know in Puerto Rico this might be confusing. There's the Jones Act that imposed the American citizenship upon us, and then there is the Jones Act that is the maritime law. And so I'm referring to the Jones Act that is the maritime law, and that is the law that precludes other ships that are international ships from going into Puerto Rico without having to pay a fee or a fine and whatnot to be able to be in our ports. But for the most part, everything that comes from Puerto Rico has to follow that law. And that means that it has to make it to Puerto Rico on an American ship with an American flag with an American employees. And what that does is that it puts a surtax that we don't see. When things get to Puerto Rico, there are already a specific price that is usually 30-40% higher because of that exchange. Because if it came from any other country, it had to stop here, and it usually stops in Jacksonville. It can stop in Tampa as well, but it usually stops in Jacksonville. And that's where they have the big change of ships, and then they send it back to Puerto Rico.
Right, exactly, on American ships. So if anything's coming from overseas, meaning Europe, Asia, Africa, what have you, any kind of
Latin America,
imports,
any other country.
any other country that's not American, any imports that need to go to Puerto Rico because they were ordered to go to Puerto Rico, they need to stop first in the US mainland port to do that exchange, go on to it can't go directly and save the tariffs. It needs to do that exchange, and then Puerto Rican consumers on the island who are already strapped, especially after Maria, have to pay that surplus for that exchange. And so that's what we're talking about, and that's been going on for decades.
Yes.
So these are the types of issues that the common, like, the average American just doesn't know. Period. And so and so these are the things that though that make you, yeah, all fired up.
Those are the things that make
Yeah,
me all fire up
exactly.
for
You're
sure.
all fired up and wanting to participate and definitely organize and mobilize for change. One quick question. One of the big things, and I'm taking like a side note here because I've been working a lot with Black leaders in trying to bring down the silos between Black and Brown communities because all too often we're pinned against each other, right? You divide and conquer, um, and um, and it's not cool. And I think also that we can leverage each other's strengths and
Absolutely.
and experiences to really elevate and reach. Se me ha metido en la cabeza. Like I have this fixation now on social mobility and building wealth, but the only way we can do it is coming together. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think we have to. We cannot try to organize and mobilize alone, right? That's why I work with all these other organizations that are not necessarily Puerto Rican based, because
Mm.
again, they've been here, we've been here, our stories are similar, we understand each other, and as long as we can talk to each other and explain what we want, usually when one of us groups wins, we all win.
Oh,
And
win.
when
Yes,
one
I
of
know.
us, yes, when one of us is able to achieve a win, it affects, it creates a ripple effect on all the other groups. So yes,
Yeah.
we definitely have to continue to organize with the Black community, and also understanding that Puerto Rico has a very rich Black community that has been left behind, including by
Hmm.
activists and our world. And it's not only Black Americans, but it's also Black Puerto Ricans that we have to organize with, because they have a different life experience, even if they are Puerto Rican and grew up in Puerto Rico, or if you're diaspora and you grew up here and that's your life experience. Their life experience is so different because of their color of their
Yes.
skin.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's one of the things that I've always it always shocks me when I'm in, because I've been living here on the mainland US for over 25 years now, right? But it always shocks me when I'm in, like, on a committee or like in a group, again, organized, right, and mobilizing, and there's a Latino that maybe hasn't been here, as long. So a cult like time spent here on the mainland US makes a difference too in terms of that lens and how you even self-identify. And so then I've had conversations or comments made by, well, I don't understand the concept of person of color, right? And it's because they might be Latino, they're Latino, but maybe they present with a lighter skin, right? That they present white in their mind. And
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
so these are tough and sensitive conversations to be had, because while maybe, Latinos that come to the US that are fair skinned, or white, what's defined here as white, maybe they haven't experienced in their country of origin discrimination, because in our countries there is that racism and
Yes.
discrimination, but they haven't
Mm-hmm.
felt it, and so it happened recently with a South American compañero, right, a friend too, that he made the comment, well, I don't know, I'm from such and such a country, and I don't, we never experienced that. And I'm like, yeah, because in your country the people that are discriminated against are indigenous, and you're not indigenous, you don't present indigenous because it's in there. I don't care what they say. It's in the
Exactly.
DNA,
And that's
But
where we
yeah,
need to communicate those things. Absolutely.
yeah,
And that's why I
yeah,
said that not only working with the Black community here, which has a lot of power, and there is a lot of things that we have to do for the movements that they have created and for the fights they have fought. But
yeah.
we cannot leave our Black communities behind.
No, Definitely. And our indigenous communities too. And so
Hmm.
it's having these open conversations about what that hierarchy was established, right, by society and by the colonizers, really, right? Las castas, what that looks like when we move here, this caste system, when we move here to the US, because it turns out I had this conversation with my friend Jackie one time. We were actually at a follow-up women's march event here in Florida at the big
Hmm.
church. And I remember that she was so excited because I went to Washington with my comadres, back to the comadres, with my comadre. We didn't know we were the Comadres in Action back then, but now we do.
You got it now. You
Anyway,
got
so
it.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So we went to Washington. When I came back, my friend Jackie couldn't go to Washington, but she's like, "Oh my God, they're having a follow-up event here in Orlando. Can we go?" So I said, "Sure." So her, Nancy Rosado, and
Hmm.
I went. And so then this Caucasian woman stood on the podium, and she started by saying something like, "I want to start by this event." There were like 600 women. It was crazy. It was awesome. So she's like, "I want to start by apologizing to my black and brown sisters, for being that person that years ago, would be in the break room at work. And when one of you left the room and they started talking smack about you, I stayed quiet. I didn't say
Mm.
anything, like that when they said derogatory things, right?" So she kept on saying, "My black and brown sisters, do you forgive me?" And everybody, "Ah!" And then my friend Jackie is Puerto Rican, but she's very fair, and she has a thick accent. And she's been living here for like maybe 10, 12 years. So she tells me, she kept on with this thing, right, about "forgive me, my black and brown sisters," and everyone was going nuts. And at one point, when everyone was quieting down, Jackie looks at me and she says, "Mira, que eso de brown? I understand black, but what is brown?" Right? And so then I tell her, "Tú."
Wow.
And I told her, "Tú? You?" And she looks at her arm. And I say, "Yeah, mama, you look white, but when you open your mouth, you brown." And so it was like right there and then she had like an aha moment, and
Uh-huh.
she owns it. Now she gets it, because I told her, this is how they roll here, and so then while you have these ideas in your head from how you grew up and where you're from and all of that. Okay. When you're here, this is how you're seen when you show up and
Exactly.
open your mouth. You may pass, but the minute you open your mouth, "Mom, I'm sorry, you brown." So this is the kind of, education that sometimes it's hard for people to listen. I mean, it could get pretty contentious depending on
Hmm. Yes, it can.
depending on the spaces, right? If it's not a safe space, you drop a comment like that, you better run because they'll come out to get you.
And that's why, but we have to be courageous because otherwise we're not going to be able to build upon what we have done on the last few years. But also the organizations that we're working with, which I know you're working with a lot of them also, they are
Yeah,
going to see right through that, and that's not what
yeah,
is in their ethos, that's not what is in their values, and they're going to drop you, and they're going to say,
yeah,
well, if that's how you guys are going to roll and you're going to perpetuate this white supremacy that you were ingrained because you are American citizens and you are Americanized, then we don't want you here. And that's the
yeah,
right, unless we come
yes,
correct and unless we come with the strength that we need to come to have these difficult conversations and liberate each other from what we
yeah,
have been taught wrongly. um,
yeah.
then we shouldn't be in those spaces.
Yes, absolutely. So listen, this episode of I Have Something to Say is going to air after the upcoming general election, a few days after.
Mm,
And so let's not talk about whatever the outcome is. We can only pray at this point because Lord knows we've been mobilizing
yes,
and organizing and participating, and representing at the polls, but what are some, now that we're talking about inaction, Comadres in Action, about the sisterhood, and I want to really appeal to women of color, women of color, the comadres. I feel, I strongly believe that we're basically literally birthing the next generation of Americans. And so what is that call to action as we step into the next 4 years, regardless of what the outcome is? Because as you mentioned, there's a lot of educating to do, also, on both the Republican and Democratic side, about diversity and about the needs of diverse communities. And so what does that look like in your eye, in terms of a movement like Comadres in Action?
Yeah, so I think, of course, if you're already registered to vote, go vote. I think voting is very, very important. But I think besides that, voting is the beginning of your civil engagement and your civic responsibility. And to vote and then go back home and do nothing else, it really doesn't do much, right? This type of vote is every 4 years. If you vote on the other ones, on the ones that are every 2 years, then you vote every 2 years. But more than that, you have to be communicating with the organizations doing the work, and
Hmm.
volunteering for them, or perhaps looking to work in their campaigns, on issue-based campaigns, right? We just had, was it 2 years ago already, a year and a half ago already, where we were able to give 1.6 million returning citizens, people with felony convictions, their right to vote. Those are the
Hmm.
type of campaigns, issue-based campaigns, that are so important, even more so than partisan campaigns. And the other thing is, if the person that we want to win wins, that doesn't mean the work is over. That means it's the beginning, right? We know Biden is not progressive. We know Biden has a lot of things he needs to be educated on. And so, on that sense, if he wins, there is so much work that we still need to get done. And it won't be done unless we have the numbers, right, of people making the phone calls, creating the campaigns, visiting the House of Representatives, visiting the senators, and so again, we organize, but we organize with a goal to mobilize. And after November
Yes.
3rd, mobilization has to be even bigger than it's been today.
Yeah.
But for yes, for sure, vote. But don't think that voting is the end. Voting is the beginning. And then after we win, the campaign has to be, okay, now we need you to audit the debt. Now we need you to make sure that women's rights are protected. Now we need you to make sure that you get rid of the junta, right? Puerto Rico has a
Yeah.
junta in 2020. We have to make
Hmm.
sure he understands that, and that his cabinet and the other people around him understand that and work to get rid of it.
Hmm. And also the issues that impact people living with dignity, which is housing and education and access to health care, the environment. I mean, all of these things, just pick one. If something has to matter to you, something. If you have kids, maybe it's education. If you have some kind of a chronic respiratory disease, maybe it's the environment. I don't know if you're a
And
survivor.
healthcare,
Maybe
like
it's
you
healthcare,
just
right?
mentioned, healthcare. We have a
Yeah.
bill that has 119 co-signers,
Yeah.
119 co-signers, Medicare for all. He should be working on that. And he has expressed how he doesn't support Medicare for all, but we need him to make support, and we need him to support it. There is no way around it, especially after this
Right.
pandemic and what we've seen with healthcare. We have to make him support it. There's no way around
Yes.
it.
Yeah. And so, Maria, it's as simple as Googling and finding those organizations that their sole purpose is to focus on these key issues and getting involved. And sometimes it's just a signature, like you just said. Maybe they just need the people to say presente, to represent and say, you know what, this is important to me. I read what they're pushing, and what they're trying to achieve. I agree with that. And if at the very least You know, if the one thing that could help, you know, is my signature, you know what? I'll sign it. Just so you could get just one more body, one breathing right here. But pulse, someone with a pulse, right? A breathing live human
Exactly.
being that has a say to say, I stand with this and I agree with that, you know, and that's how you chip in. It's really not that complicated. Just pick your
It's really
purpose
not. It's
and
really not.
participate. Yeah. So I think this is fantastic. It really shows how you can plug in and feel like you're doing something for the local, regional, state, you know, and national and also global, because we don't live in a bubble, right? I mean, we can see how
We
even the
don't.
pandemic, you know, has affected the entire world. And so this was great, because I hope I really hope, you know, people um were able to see and learn how to get involved and really be part of change, and feel like they have and realize that they have a stake in the outcomes of yeah of the political process, and you know, on whether they engage civically or not, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you, Maria, for joining us. I'm sure we're going to be on a call or two, or we're going to be doing a lot of work together in the upcoming 4 years. And I'm really looking forward to it.
Likewise. Likewise. Thank you so much. Thank you for the convo today.
Yes, absolutely. I'll see you soon. Okay.
Take care.
This concludes this episode of I Have Something to Say. We want to thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to tell your friends about us. We're on Spotify and iTunes as well. There's more to come next week. And remember, if you have something to say, it's time to speak up.